All right, welcome everybody. It's the Real Crusades History live stream, Coffee and the Crusades, where we do Q&A on medieval history and just kind of do updates on how things are going with Real Crusades History, the channel. Hope everybody's doing well. Good to see those of you who are here. Welcome to Coffee and the Crusades. I've got my coffee right here in my Battle of Hastings mug, which you can get from the Real Crusades History store if you are so inclined. Which I need to get some new stuff on there. I'm having some new artwork made, so I should be able to get some new stuff going for the shop before too long. I want to have something for the Battle of Montcassard. I think that would be a good shirt idea. I can imagine you guys would agree. But here we are. Here we are doing Coffee and the Crusades again. We're back to doing this every Tuesday at noon Eastern time, Eastern U.S. time, and 11 Central time, Great Plains time. We've got Alexander here saying good afternoon from Sweden, the great country of Sweden, Viking country, one of the great Norse countries. A lot of great history there. We got Zach here. Hello, Zach. Our good buddy Lambert is here. Of course, Sir Knight Jonathan Phelps. And we got Tanner saying this is finally his chance to catch one, so that's good. And we've got Bleak, our good friend Bleak. So everybody's here. We've got the old band back together, as it were. So yeah, this is just kind of a casual thing, guys. Whatever you would like to talk about. It is an audience-driven stream. What I like to do is just let you guys ask questions, and we already have some questions. And I need to get the power chat thing set up again. As usual, I'm behind on stuff like that. They changed from their beta phase to more of the I guess the proper up and running phase, and I guess I have to re-register for that or something, so I'm going to do that. Yeah, Sir Knight says he posted a bunch of questions already, which is good. So what have you guys been thinking about lately? What are your medieval thoughts? Sam is here. Gory Gremlin is here. Flack is here. Zytron's here. Everybody's here. We got the band back together, everybody. And yes, I'm going to jump back to your questions, Jonathan, and let everybody else ask questions as well. I hope everybody enjoyed having Helena on last week. It is always fun having her as a part of the stream. She's quite knowledgeable, and it's interesting to get her opinions on things. So currently what I'm working on, just in case you guys are wondering what's up, I'm going to be up on the channel next. I'm doing a hour-length documentary about Richard the Lionheart's imprisonment in Germany, which is quite an interesting topic, somewhat of a depressing topic. But, honestly, one of those things that contributes to his sort of legendary status, that's kind of an epic in itself. I mean, after the Third Crusade, he ends up being imprisoned by these vile thugs, these vile Hohenstaufen thugs. And I don't think that's an unfair way of characterizing it. I don't know what you guys think about Henry VI, the son of Fred Barbarossa. But yeah, I mean, he's one of the worst of the worst. He's a snake. And what he did to Sicily is pretty vile. One of the truly vile actors in history for that period. And I also think that Richard's capture and the fact that he was held for a year, it was a huge blow to the cause of the Crusades in general, because here you have the great hero of the Third Crusade, and this is a man who achieved a lot for Christendom. The idea behind the Crusades was, let's set aside these petty squabbles among kings within Christendom and focus on what the church perceived to be as the real battle, which is fighting the enemies of Christendom. So this frontier battle, no longer are we fighting in here, we're fighting out here against the enemies of Christendom. And so you have this man who really is kind of the embodiment of that, Richard I of England. He's a great warrior. He's a courageous warrior. And he's done the work, while other people like Philip II and Henry VI were neglecting this work that the church identified as being for the good of Christendom. He does this. Against all odds, he defeats Saladin and restores a good portion of the kingdom of Jerusalem. And then on his way home, he's treated like a criminal by the Holy Roman Emperor without any justification. I mean, that's one thing we have to understand too. I think it's funny when people always say, well, didn't he have the Duke of Austria's banner thrown down at Acre or something? Honestly, there's not much reason to think that even happened. It may have happened. And we'll get into some of that with this documentary that's coming out. It's going to be out before April 30th. That's my current deadline for the latest video. But even if it did happen, even if that did happen, does that justify dealing with the King of England who had just done, all this important work for Christendom? Does that justify treating him that way? No, it's a disgraceful thing. And yet what Zach is saying, jealousy, yes. In fact, the author of the biography of William Marshall kind of points that out. This glare is annoying me. He points that out, that there was a lot of jealousy of King Richard, and he views that as the reason he was treated in that way. And I think that was part of it. It was also political, but it was totally unjustified, and kind of put things in perspective about where Christendom was at that point. You've got somebody like Richard who's willing to do the work, and then you've got the other rulers in Christendom who aren't. And not only that, but they're going to work against him for doing it because he's making them look bad, and they view it as an opportunity. Philip II and Henry VI said to themselves, oh, well, this guy is off doing this in the Holy Land. Let's mess with him while he's away. Let's see if we can gain some kind of advantage over him. And that is, Eleanor of Aquitaine, while this was happening, while her son was imprisoned, wrote a bunch of letters to the Pope saying exactly this. She was saying, what's going on here, Your Holiness? Is the church's mission a joke? She pointed out rightly that this was a scandal to all crusaders. Here you have the man who's actually doing the work. The church's promise to crusaders is that while you're away on crusade, your lands, your family, all this will be protected by the church. What happens to Richard on his way home? Now, the church did excommunicate the Duke of Austria, but the Pope was hesitant to do that to the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. He was threatening them with it the whole time, but he never actually did it because he was too nervous about doing that. What do you guys think about that? I mean, I just think it's a striking moment in the history of the Crusades, and it kind of says something about the problem between the ideal of crusading versus the reality of where Christendom was, where Europe was at the close of the 12th century. You just had a lot of lack of commitment to this ideal that the church had laid out. People like Richard the Lionheart are committed to it, but if you've got so many people who are not only not committed to it, but are willing to use it as a weapon against those who are committed to it, what problem does that introduce? I think it kind of demonstrates the problem of the Crusades, especially in the Holy Land, where they weren't dependent on the political interests of, like the kings of Spain. The kings of Spain had their own political interests that oriented them towards their own crusading efforts at home. But the Holy Land was dependent on the goodwill of people like the King of France, the King of England, the Holy Roman Emperor. And if the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor are willing to use the crusade as an opportunity to undermine their political enemies, and that's how they view it. Think about that problem. That's why I think we have to recognize the Crusades, crusading as this ideal laid out by the popes, especially by Pope Urban II. He lays out the ideal at the start of the First Crusade. We have to recognize the Crusades as an ideal that was never fully realized, because Europe never really put aside fully its internal political conflicts, which such is life, right? I mean, this is how life itself works. Ideals and then reality getting in the way of them, or the inability to manifest an ideal fully because of human nature. It's the tragedy of the human experience, which is, again, one of the things that makes the Crusades fascinating. And one of the things I find interesting about doing the story of Richard's imprisonment, which, again, that is my current project. That's the video that's going to be out in a couple weeks before April 30th, an hour-plus documentary about Richard's imprisonment and his freedom. And one thing that I was struck by, and okay, I'll get to this too, but what this taught Richard is that he had to deal with his political issues before he could fully deal with the crusade. When Richard gets back to his kingdom, he's thinking, okay, all right, so clearly I'm going to have to take out the King of France before I get back to the Holy Land. And I think he was right. I mean, people who want to criticize him for devoting the last part of his reign to his war in France, I mean, how can you blame him? He was right. I have no doubt that he was fully committed to fully restoring the kingdom of Jerusalem, but he understood that I've got enemies at home that I have to deal with first. And he very nearly did. He was on the verge of pretty much wiping out the Capetian dynasty, when he died young. A tragedy, in my opinion. Okay. Interesting question here from Zach. I wonder how Bernard of Clairvaux would have handled this. Right. Exactly. The church, this was a sign of the church, a real crisis for the church, that they couldn't prevent this from happening. And people took notice of this. You don't get another major crusading movement again until the Fifth Crusade. Or no, one of the reasons why the Fourth Crusade even happened was because, you guys might find this interesting. Richard's death is what kind of triggered the Fourth Crusade. Because all of a sudden, the knightly elite in France and in England, who basically they'd all kind of decided they were going to go with Richard. This is the interesting thing. Before Richard died, he basically stripped Philip of all of his alliances. Everybody was going to go with Richard. Part of that was because Richard was the better man. And this is the way politics worked for these men. Everybody knew Philip was a despicable worm. Everybody knew that John was a despicable worm. And everybody was kind of saying to themselves, well, you know what? We're going to go with Richard. And Richard's early death kind of caused this black cloud to descend over France and England. Everybody said, okay, now Philip and John are going to be in charge. And that's a shame. That's how everybody was looking at it. These noble men who were men of chivalry, who were knightly men, they were staring at a situation that was pretty bleak. It was pretty bleak. They all knew that John and Philip were a couple of worms, were a couple of dogs. And God, these are going to be the guys that we're going to have to pick between. How do you pick between that? So everybody says, what the heck? Let's just go on crusade. Let's all go on crusade. In fact, let's do Richard's crusade. That's what the Fourth Crusade was. It was before Richard died. The crusade was called in 1098 by Innocent III. There was no response to it because everybody was going to help Richard take out Philip. But then Richard dies. And everybody says, okay, let's go on crusade. That's when the Fourth Crusade really got going, was because Richard had died, and nobody wanted to face the reality that Philip and John were now the people who were going to be in charge, which was a huge tragedy. Lambert says, despicable worms, tell us how you really feel. It's the truth, Lambert. I mean, let's just be honest about these guys. Philip II is a despicable worm. John is a worm. John killed his own nephew. I have no doubt about that. And Philip is the one who really undermined the Third Crusade. I mean, let's be honest about it. He went home because he knew that Richard was going to stay, and he proceeded to try to dismantle the Angevin Empire while the ruler of the Angevin Empire was waging the Third Crusade. I mean, if we kind of take on the perspective of Christendom at this time, which is the idea that crusading is kind of the noble cause, and this is how people felt, you can't help but view Philip and John as kind of the the arch villains of the situation, and the Holy Roman Emperor too. Anyway, I'll try not to ramble too much anymore, guys, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I'm working on this large video project about this, and I'm looking forward to putting it out. It'll be out soon. As you guys know, everything I do now is kind of like an hour-plus length video that I put out every month and a half or so, along with the shorts that come out, almost daily. So Lambert says, I agree with you. Your description is hilarious. Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know. It's kind of striking. It's striking the difference between these individuals. I mean, and, Henry VI was also just kind of this vile person who, was willing to do very ugly things. And Richard just wasn't like that. I mean, it's funny. He has this reputation for being this, some kind of a thug, but he was a man who was respected, across social lines, because of how he dealt with people. He was a just man. He was a wise, just, and capable ruler. And his biggest flaw was that he was always too close to the action. And that's what took him out in the end, too young, and left the cowards to kind of divide up the corpse of France and England. So, okay. So, let me get to action. I'm going to focus on whatever you guys want to talk about. I apologize for the lengthy rant, but maybe that's part of what this is all about anyways, is doing those rants. So, not that I think it was a rant. I think that what I'm saying is entirely fair. I know rant is kind of just like a byword for a lengthy discussion, but I think everything I'm saying is fair. I really do. Chris says, I really enjoy these freeform discussions. I didn't know Philip was such a lowlife. Yeah, he was. It's funny. And thank you, Chris. The first thing he does is, when he's on his way back, he goes to the Pope. He goes to Rome on his way home, and he asks the Pope to sanction his war against Richard. I mean, lying to the Pope in the process. That's the other thing. Philip was just a liar, Let's see here. Okay. No worries. We love them. Okay. Awesome. I appreciate that. Okay. So let's actually do some questions now. I appreciate everybody hanging out. This is a fun little hangout. I'm glad we're doing this again. So Philip says, found of things like the money he got from Richard's capture was the exact same sum that Richard had gotten from Tancred of Lys, who had taken Sicily from Henry. Not quite sure if that's a question, but yeah, I think that Henry VI. Okay, but I see what you're saying. Was just a payback. Yeah, BS. So what was happening there was Richard took back the dowry for his sister, who was Queen of Sicily. And the reality is that Henry had no right to rule Sicily. Henry VI's conquest of Sicily was entirely unjustified, and it was an act of brutality and aggression that was destructive to Christendom and was in stark contrast to the work that Richard did in, the building up of Christendom over the course of the Third Crusade. So, Maria, I recently started studying the Crusades, and one of the first things I've noticed is the lack of unity and support amongst Christian kingdoms compared to the Muslims. It's incredible they got so far. Interesting comment, Maria. I appreciate that. I will say this. It was the same thing with the Muslims. It was the same kind of internal fighting. I mean, for example, Nur ad-Din, when he died, he said basically, like, his last words were that the biggest problem in his life was Saladin. Now, I always find this funny because Nur ad-Din is kind of considered to be the pre-Saladin Saladin. And Saladin was kind of his protege, but he set up a rival kingdom to Nur ad-Din's, and they were on the verge of civil war with each other. So I think that often, we kind of have a sharper lens from an English-speaking perspective. We are studying the Christian side and the internal Christian side more closely than the Muslim side. And so we kind of miss the fact that these internal conflicts existed within Islamic civilization as well. The difference is possibly that in Islam, you didn't have this independent institution of the church constantly saying, hey, you guys need to stop doing this and get down to the real work. You had like Muslim scholars doing that. And it's true that a Muslim ruler kind of needed to act in the interest of Islam and not just constantly fight his fellow Muslims to acquire this wider legitimacy in the Muslim world. But often that could be done as kind of a gesture. Saladin's just a good example of this. I mean, you could kind of look at any ruler, but Saladin spent most of his time dealing with his Muslim rivals. Like, he took out the Zengid dynasty, which, this was the dynasty that had been the great enemies of the Crusaders over the previous decades. And that was his big project, was, getting control of Aleppo and these different Zengid strongholds. And this was a long-term project of his. So I think that, if we look closely, we see it's kind of the same thing in the Muslim world. This ideal of holy war that both sides had, it was never fully realized by either side, which is, kind of what makes it interesting. So, yeah. And Lambert says, if Nur ad-Din had lived, it's likely Jerusalem would have been forced to choose a side in the civil war that would have followed. Interesting point, Lambert. Interesting point. And I think that there would have been an obvious choice for that. It would have been the same side that they picked later after Nur ad-Din died, because the Crusaders had alliances with the Zengids. Of course, they're going to pick the Zengids. At least I would think they would, because Egypt is the much more potent enemy. And the reality is that if they had just helped Saladin, then why would they help Saladin take out the person that's keeping Saladin from controlling Damascus? As long as you keep Damascus and Cairo separated, that's kind of the crucial thing. Okay, I'm going to cough, guys. I'm going to go off camera here. All right. I need a cough button, I guess. So Flack says, when Muslim peasants spent time under Christian rule, many preferred it to Muslim rule. Yeah, we have at least one Muslim chronicler who says this. That is, what's that guy's name? Ibn Jubayr, who wrote this very famous account of his travel through through the Kingdom of Jerusalem, through kind of like Syria and Palestine. He was actually from Spain, I believe. But he said that his impression was that Muslims felt more content under Christian rule. And an interesting scholar, a guy named, was it Amin Malouf, who wrote the Crusades through Arab Eyes? He talked about this kind of at length at the outro to that book. And he felt that this had something to do with the more, what he kind of viewed as, and this is a Muslim scholar, by the way, he's from Lebanon, I believe, the more consistent nature of the legal structures in the Crusader states. That, and this is kind of something Ibn Jubayr says. He says the justice of the Franks on which the Muslims can always rely. And he's talking more about, and this is kind of what Amin Malouf said, that the Crusader states, like all of the Western states, based on these ideas of Roman law, this more structured and legalistic approach to the law, there were these institutions that were kind of reliably there, that kind of stayed in place. And Amin Malouf felt that that wasn't as much the case in the Muslim states, and that's an interesting thing to look at, is the difference between the way Muslim and Latin Christian states were structured, the different ideas of the law itself. And I think that, in the Latin Christian world, and this isn't just maybe necessarily even specifically Christian versus Muslim. I think even if you look at kind of the Byzantine state versus the Latin states, there's more of this idea of these institutions that don't change. Like, think about how, Saladin, when he cobbles together this empire, he's Sultan of Egypt and Syria. And then that title kind of goes away with him. It's kind of a title that fits the role he had. Whereas in the West, you've got the idea of, okay, the Count of Tripoli, that's a thing. That's an entity that exists. No matter how much of the county of Tripoli is gone, even if the whole county's gone, that entity still kind of exists, and it can be claimed by someone who's like the King of Spain or something, centuries later. These very fixed institutions that are a feature of Western governments in the medieval era. This is kind of this legacy of the Romans to some extent. So, I don't know. What do you guys think? Jonathan asks, were Christians allowed to build their churches under Muslim rule? The Franks allowed the Muslims to practice their faith. It's a complicated question because it varied depending on the ruler. But definitely there were churches in areas ruled by Muslims, and there were Christians living there. There were Christian communities. I always think of an interesting example. Usama ibn Munkid, in his biography, he talks about attending, like, his family ruled, this Muslim dynasty ruled this almost fortress state of Shizar. And there were Christians living in the lands of Shizar. And Usama talks about going to the festivals of the Christians, with his family. Like, this was the thing to do. The Christians were having their festival this week, so we're going to hang out. This is what people do. So you can kind of see how in these places where you've got both communities, you will have, almost the cultural lives of both bleeding over into each other. The Christians are having a festival. We'll go to it. It's a fun thing to do, So there were definitely restrictions for both if they were living under the rule of a ruler of the opposite faith. So this was a thing. But they could be pretty lax. I mean, that's the impression I get. They could be pretty severe, or they could be pretty lax. So it's definitely it's a topic that invites a lot of study and a lot of commentary, because at different times it kind of depended on the ruler, the situation. So Flack says, was succession more based on force or cult of personality in Muslim states? That's a complicated question. It was more, there was a tribal element to it. Like, one thing that we look at Saladin, part of how his empire functioned is he had a coalition of different tribal chieftains. The head of this particular group of Turkomans, uh, families who ruled certain states or dominated certain towns, like, who's the emir of Homs or whatever, and how is how is he going to be loyal to my particular dynasty? Like, Saladin established kind of a family dynasty that dominated the territory for a while, but it wasn't like he was occupying a specific institution. There was a lot more of a religious element to the authority as well. Like, Saladin, it's like, once a Muslim ruler achieved a certain amount of power, he was then kind of the defender of the faith. I forget the exact title in Islam. Maybe somebody here remembers it, but like the sword of the faith or something like this. And, this kind of almost became the de facto role of that ruler once he achieved a certain amount of power. But the path to that power could vary. Saladin started by getting control of Egypt. Now, Egypt already had a state in place. It already had, this, the Fatimid Caliphate had built up a state there. Saladin kind of took control of that, and then he started adding various territories to it. But yeah, it's kind of interesting how it wasn't like, compare that to, how did Frederick II try to get control of the Kingdom of Jerusalem? Well, he tried to get the crown of Jerusalem. It's just a little bit different. It's like you've got these, and I hope I'm not explaining it poorly, but you've got like these very concrete ideas of institutions in the West versus this more fluid nature of how power worked in the Islamic world. What kind of coalition could you bring together? Whose loyalty could you attract? There was a certain amount of cult of personality to that, for sure. But then you think about how quickly Saladin's empire collapsed into kind of these warring Ayyubid princes. The Ayyubids were engaged in civil war for decades after that. Decades. It's really striking. Okay. All right. Well, we'll do a few more questions here, guys. This has been fun as usual. Tom, are there any Crusader artifacts on exhibit in Jerusalem? Yeah, I mean, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is in Jerusalem. There's a lot of stuff from the Crusader period in Jerusalem, for sure. Were Christian farmlands and farmers protected by knights in the realm of the Kingdom of Jerusalem? Yes. That was the role of the military establishment, was to protect the countryside, essentially. That was the point of the castles. You can prevent, Saladin or whatever neighboring Muslim ruler from coming in and, burning the cropland. Because that's kind of how warfare went. It was tit for tat. The Christians would raid Muslim farmland. The Muslims would raid Christian farmland. You go in, one way to undermine your enemies, to go into their territory and devastate the territory, which is the source of the wealth. So Baldwin IV, what's the first thing he does once he becomes king of Jerusalem? Well, not once he becomes king of Jerusalem, but once he has control of the government. He is out of his minority. He's now the king, not just in name, but he's acting as king. He launches a raid against territory in Damascus, against some of Saladin's territory attached to Damascus. He burns some farms and villages there. It's a way to open up hostility with his opponent. Okay. Let's do a couple more questions, guys, and then we'll kind of close it down for the week. Jonathan asks, was the castle at Jacob's Ford a serious threat to Saladin? If it was allowed to stand, how would it have threatened his kingdom? It was right there next to his territories, across the Jordan. So it was a strategically significant site. Yes, it would have pretty much allowed the Templars to dominate territory that was very close to some of the important lands of the Emirate of Damascus. Okay, we'll do this as, let's see here. I'm just going to jump up here and see what else you guys have been asking. Maria says, thank you for responding to my first message. Would you say that the medieval ages were mostly peaceful and not really as dark as many believe? Well, I mean, warfare was, a regular feature of the medieval era. Sometimes military conflict doesn't mean that things are dark, though. I mean, look at Renaissance Italy. Renaissance Italy was a pretty big mess in terms of fighting and political fragmentation, and yet it was a springtime of the arts for sure. So I will say this, though, medieval warfare was not as destructive as people necessarily imagine. It could be a lot more a lot more localized than you might think, especially compared to modern warfare. Like warfare in the modern world, it devastates entire regions very quickly. Whereas in the Middle Ages, I mean, you might go and burn some farmland over here, but then the farm next over is untouched and nobody even really knows anything's going on. I mean, we hear stories about during the long war between Baldwin IV and Saladin, where when the Christian Muslim armies were kind of maneuvering in the field against each other, the merchants would just go around them to carry goods to the cities, So, yeah, I mean, warfare was a common feature, but it wasn't, you can't really compare it to modern warfare, which is so much more destructive. I mean, it was destructive and it could be destructive. But I think people imagine this image that like peasants were just cowering in the field all the time, waiting for an army to come by and burn everything. I don't think that's the case at all. There were periods where maybe that was going on, but it wasn't a constant by any means. And there were a lot of periods where just nothing like that was going on. So, and I definitely don't think the Middle Ages were dark. I think it was a time of a lot of art, a lot of beauty, and a lot of advances that would contribute to the emergence of the modern world. So, okay, guys. So thanks. So let's go ahead and wrap it up for now. We'll do this again next Tuesday, same time. Come back and join us. We will do another Coffee on the Crusades. Ask me anything about the Crusades. I'll talk to you guys then. Have a good week.